The Fox News studio was electric with tension as two political heavyweights prepared for what would become the most explosive confrontation in recent television history. Mark Levin, the 73-year-old conservative radio legend known as the Great One, sat across from Representative Jasmine Crockett, the 43-year-old Democrat from Texas, who had no idea she was about to become a viral sensation. What happened in the next 25 minutes would break the internet, trend on every social platform, and leave Levin speechless for the first time in his 5-decade career. The moment Crockett delivered her 7th response, after being rudely interrupted 6 times, the entire conservative media establishment would realize they had catastrophically underestimated this former defense attorney turned congresswoman. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, and make sure to hit that subscribe button because you absolutely won't want to miss what happens when political titans clash like this. Trust us, you've never seen anything quite like this before. The studio lights blazed as Sean Hannity stepped forward to introduce what he thought would be another routine political debate. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have a very special confrontation. On one side, Mark Levin, the Great One himself, conservative icon and best-selling author. On the other side, Democratic Representative Jasmine Crockett from Texas, here to defend her party's radical agenda. The audience erupted in applause, mostly from conservative supporters who had come expecting to witness their champion demolish another liberal politician. They had no idea they were about to witness political history in the making. Levin adjusted his signature glasses and cracked his knuckles, a habit he had developed over decades of preparing to intellectually destroy political opponents on live television. His producer had briefed him earlier that day with what seemed like simple instructions. Jasmine Crockett is a freshman congresswoman, young and inexperienced. She's never faced anything like your intensity. This should be easy. These young Democrats don't know how to handle real confrontation, Levin had confidently told his staff just hours before the show. I'll have her stumbling over her words within the first 5 minutes. His team had laughed and agreed, already planning the social media clips they would share of another Levin victory. The conservative media machine had been building up this confrontation for weeks. Levin's radio show had spent multiple segments attacking Crockett's voting record, her background, and what he repeatedly called her dangerous socialist agenda. His millions of listeners had been calling in for days, demanding that he expose her on live television. The expectation was crystal clear. This would be another easy victory for the conservative establishment. But something was different about the way Jasmine Crockett sat in that chair. While other Democratic politicians had appeared nervous or defensive when facing Levin's legendary aggression, she displayed a calm composure that should have been everyone's first warning sign. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. Her expression was serene, and when she looked directly into the camera during Hannity's introduction, there was something in her eyes that suggested she hadn't come for a typical political discussion. She had come for war. Behind the scenes, Crockett's preparation had been methodical, thorough, and absolutely devastating. Her chief of staff had compiled over 40 hours of Levin's previous interviews, identifying his patterns, his favorite attack lines, his preferred interruption points, and most importantly, his habit of interrupting women guests far more frequently than men. She had studied his techniques like a lawyer preparing for the most important cross-examination of her career, because that's exactly what this was going to be. The research had revealed disturbing patterns. In interviews with male politicians, Levin averaged 2.3 interruptions per 10-minute segment. With female politicians, that number jumped to 8.7 interruptions. The data was clear. Levin used interruption as a weapon to silence women, and he had been getting away with it for years. The green room conversations before the show had been telling. Levin's team was joking about how quickly they expected this to be over. "Give it 10 minutes and she'll be crying," one producer had laughed, mimicking what he thought would be Crockett's inevitable breakdown. These young women can't handle the Great One's intensity. Meanwhile, Crockett sat quietly in her own green room, reviewing her notes with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing for a life-saving operation. When a makeup artist asked if she was nervous about facing the legendary Mark Levin, she simply smiled and said, "I've faced tougher crowds than this." What the makeup artist didn't know was that Crockett had spent years as one of Texas's most formidable defense attorneys, representing clients in hostile courtrooms where prosecutors and judges regularly tried to intimidate her into submission. She had developed a reputation for staying calm under pressure and then delivering devastating counterattacks that left her opponents reeling. The stage was set for what would become the most watched political confrontation of the year, a battle between old-school conservative aggression and new-generation democratic precision. What neither the audience nor Levin himself knew was that Crockett had spent years preparing for this exact moment, even if she hadn't known it at the time. Every hostile courtroom had been training. Every aggressive prosecutor had been practice. Every condescending judge had been preparation for this single moment when she would face down the conservative media's most feared attack dog. As the cameras rolled and the red lights indicated they were live to millions of viewers across America, Levin leaned forward with the predatory smile of a hunter who had just spotted what he thought was easy prey. His eyes gleamed with the confidence that had made him a conservative icon, completely unaware that he was actually walking into a trap that had been set weeks in advance. The trap was about to be sprung by one of the sharpest legal minds to ever enter Congress. And Mark Levin was about to learn that interrupting Jasmine Crockett 6 times would be the biggest mistake of his entire career. Mark Levin had built his entire legendary career on one devastatingly simple formula: attack first. Attack hard and never ever let your opponent get a word in edgewise. At 73 years old, he wasn't just a conservative commentator, he was a conservative institution, a political force of nature who had shaped Republican thinking for decades. Born in Philadelphia to a working-class Jewish family, Levin had clawed his way to the top of conservative media through sheer intellectual firepower and an absolutely uncompromising devotion to constitutional conservatism. His journey had taken him from the Reagan administration, where he served as an associate director in the Office of Policy Development, to the presidency of the landmark Legal Foundation, to the pinnacle of talk radio success. His resume read, like a conservative Hall of Fame, multiple New York Times best-selling books including Liberty and Tyranny, The Great One Show, that dominated talk radio ratings across America, and a television program that reached millions of devoted followers every single night. His fans didn't just call him the Great One as a nickname. They genuinely believed he was the most intellectually gifted conservative voice in America. But it was his interview style that had made Levin both famous and feared throughout political circles. He would spend hours researching his opponent's weaknesses, identifying their most vulnerable positions, and then preparing devastating attacks designed to expose them as frauds and hypocrites. His technique was surgical in its precision. Overwhelm them with rapid-fire information, interrupt constantly to keep them off balance, and never allow them to establish any rhythm or momentum that might help them fight back. Politicians who came on his show expecting a friendly conservative discussion often left feeling like they had been hit by an intellectual freight train. Democratic politicians, in particular, had learned to fear invitations to appear on Levin's program, knowing that he had destroyed careers and reputations with his legendary aggressive style. His pre-show ritual was always the same: review the research files, identify the most damaging attack angles, and then mentally prepare to unleash the full force of his personality on whatever unfortunate politician had agreed to face him. Tonight's target was supposed to be easy: a freshman congresswoman who had never faced anything like his intensity. Tonight, he was facing off against someone he clearly viewed as just another progressive politician who could be easily dismantled and discredited. Representative Jasmine Crockett, at 43, was relatively new to Congress, having been elected in 2022 during the Democratic wave that had swept several young progressives into office. From Levin's perspective, she was exactly the kind of inexperienced, idealistic politician he had been destroying for decades. But what Mark Levin didn't understand, what he was about to learn in the most humiliating way possible, was that Jasmine Crockett brought a completely different set of skills to this fight. Skills that had been honed not in the comfortable world of television studios and radio booths, but in the brutal, high-stakes environment of Texas criminal courtrooms. Jasmine Crockett's journey to this moment had been anything but typical for a politician. Born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, she had put herself through college and law school by working multiple jobs, including nights at a call center and weekends at a local restaurant. Her family didn't have political connections or wealth. They had only the belief that education and hard work could open doors that seemed impossible to open. After graduating from the University of Houston Law Center, she had built a reputation as one of Texas's most formidable defense attorneys, taking on cases that other lawyers considered unwinnable and somehow finding ways to victory. Her specialty had been representing clients who faced the full weight of an aggressive prosecution system, clients who needed someone willing to stand up to judges, prosecutors, and a system that seemed designed to crush them. But it wasn't just her legal skills that had made her reputation. It was her unique courtroom style that combined meticulous preparation with an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under the most intense pressure. Prosecutors who tried to bully her quickly learned that intimidation tactics simply bounced off her like water off a duck's back. Judges who attempted to rush her through arguments found themselves facing a lawyer who knew exactly how to use the system's own rules against them. Her most famous case had involved defending a young mother accused of a crime she clearly hadn't committed, facing a prosecutor who was running for district attorney and needed a high-profile conviction. The prosecutor had tried every intimidation tactic in the book, raising his voice, interrupting her arguments, even making personal attacks on her competence and experience. Crockett had let him rant and rave for an entire afternoon, calmly taking notes while he made a fool of himself in front of the jury. Then, during her closing argument, she had methodically dismantled every one of his arguments while pointing out his unprofessional behavior to the jury. The acquittal had taken less than an hour, and the prosecutor's political career had been over before the courtroom emptied. That case had taught her something crucial about dealing with aggressive men who thought they could intimidate her into submission. Sometimes the best strategy wasn't to match their aggression, but to let them reveal their true character while you remained calm, focused, and prepared to strike back at exactly the right moment. Her work representing women and minorities who had been failed by the justice system had really shaped her approach to confrontation. She had seen too many cases where powerful men tried to silence women through intimidation, aggression, and sheer volume. Each time, she had developed new strategies for fighting back, new ways to turn an opponent's aggression against them, new techniques for exposing bullies for what they really were. While Levin had spent decades perfecting his radio and television persona, Crockett had spent years in actual combat. Legal combat, where the stakes were people's lives and freedoms, where losing meant her clients went to prison, where there were no do-overs or second chances. Her entry into politics had been almost accidental. After years of watching prosecutors abuse their power, seeing how the criminal justice system failed the people she was trying to help, and witnessing how political decisions made in Austin and Washington directly impacted her clients' lives, she had decided that the only way to create real change was to work from within the political system itself. She had run for the Texas House of Representatives in 2020, winning in a landslide despite having no prior political experience. Her campaign had been built on the same principles that had guided her legal career: meticulous preparation, absolute honesty, and a refusal to be intimidated by powerful opponents. Her success in the Texas legislature had been immediate and impressive. While other freshman legislators struggled to get their bills heard, Crockett had managed to pass significant criminal justice reform legislation by using the same skills she had developed as a defense attorney: careful research, strategic timing, and the ability to stay calm while her opponents lost their composure. When she decided to run for Congress in 2022, political observers had wondered whether her courtroom skills would translate to the national political stage. Tonight, millions of Americans were about to get their answer. The stakes couldn't have been higher for both participants. This wasn't just about one debate or one television appearance. This was about whether the old-school conservative media machine could continue to steamroll younger Democratic politicians, or whether a new generation of leaders would stand up and fight back using tools and techniques that the conservative establishment had never encountered before. For Levin, this was supposed to be routine maintenance of his reputation as the conservative movement's most feared intellectual warrior. For Crockett, this was her opportunity to send a message to every young woman watching that they didn't have to accept being talked over, talked down to, or dismissed by men who thought their age, experience, and volume gave them the right to dominate every conversation. The conservative establishment had a well-worn playbook for dealing with young Democratic women in politics. Attack their experience, question their intelligence, use aggressive tactics to make them appear weak or emotional on television, and then use clips of their supposed breakdown to fundraise and energize the conservative base. It had worked countless times before with other progressive women who had dared to challenge conservative orthodoxy. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and other progressive women had all faced similar treatment from conservative media, and while some had fought back effectively, none had completely turned the tables on their attackers the way Crockett was about to do. Tonight was her chance to prove them all wrong. But more than that, it was her opportunity to demonstrate that the era of conservative men thinking they could bully Democratic women into silence was coming to an end. Levin adjusted his glasses and leaned forward in his chair, displaying the body language he always used when he was about to launch into one of his famous intellectual demolition jobs. His supporters in the studio audience could feel the energy building, the electric anticipation that always preceded a Levin masterpiece. They had come to see their hero destroy another liberal politician, and they were ready to cheer every devastating blow. The pre-show energy in the studio had been electric, with audience members sharing stories of previous Levin interviews where he had supposedly destroyed Democratic politicians. "Remember when he made that senator from California cry?" One audience member had whispered excitedly to another. "Tonight's going to be even better." But Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady. She had prepared for this moment her entire career, even if she hadn't realized it at the time. Every hostile courtroom, every aggressive prosecutor, every condescending judge had been training for this exact confrontation. She knew Levin's tactics because she had faced them countless times before in different forms. The difference was, this time she wasn't representing a client whose freedom hung in the balance. This time she was representing herself, her district, her party, and everyone who had ever been talked down to by men like Mark Levin. Her team had done their homework, with the thoroughness that had made her famous in legal circles. They had studied not just hours, but weeks of Levin's previous interviews, cataloged his interrupt patterns with mathematical precision, identified his favorite attack lines, and prepared responses to each one. They had analyzed his body language, his vocal patterns, his tendency to become more aggressive when he sensed weakness. Most importantly, they had developed a comprehensive strategy that would allow her to turn his greatest strength, his aggressive interruption style, into his greatest weakness. Every interruption would be counted, every disrespectful gesture would be noted, every condescending comment would be recorded for use in the devastating counterattack she was preparing to deliver. The battle lines were drawn with crystal clarity. On one side stood the conservative media establishment, represented by its most aggressive and feared attack dog. On the other side stood a new generation of Democratic leadership that absolutely refused to be intimidated, bullied, or silenced. What was about to unfold would change both of their careers forever, reshape the way political discourse happened on television for years to come, and provide a template for how to stand up to bullies that would be studied in communication classes for decades. The trap was set, the cameras were rolling, and Mark Levin was about to walk directly into the most devastating political ambush of his entire legendary career. The first interruption came exactly 47 seconds into Jasmine Crockett's opening statement, like a predator pouncing on what it perceived as easy prey. She had just begun to explain her position on healthcare policy when Mark Levin's voice cut through the studio atmosphere like a buzzsaw through silk. "That's completely false," he barked, his voice rising to the familiar shout that had made him famous across conservative America. "You Democrats always lie about health care, and I'm not going to sit here and let you spread disinformation to the American people." Crockett paused mid-sentence, looked directly at him with the calm composure of someone who had expected exactly this kind of behavior, and said simply, "Mr. Levin, I hadn't finished my thought." But Levin was already launching into a rapid-fire monologue about government healthcare programs, his hands gesticulating wildly as he buried her incomplete response under an avalanche of statistics, accusations, and conservative talking points. Behind the scenes in the Fox News control room, producers were buzzing with excitement. They had expected fireworks from this matchup, but Levin was delivering even more aggressive content than they had hoped for. His passionate, interruption-heavy style was exactly what their audience tuned in to see. The intellectual dominance that had made him a conservative icon. The control room monitors showed viewer engagement spiking immediately. Phone lines were lighting up with calls from viewers. Social media mentions were climbing rapidly, and the early signs all pointed to this becoming one of their most watched segments of the year. They had no idea they were watching the setup for one of the most devastating political counterattacks in television history. Sean Hannity tried to restore some semblance of order to the discussion, but Levin was in full attack mode now, displaying the relentless aggression that his radio audience had come to love and expect. His supporters in the studio audience began to cheer and applaud enthusiastically, sensing that their champion was dominating the debate exactly like they had expected him to do. Several audience members were already pulling out their phones to record what they assumed would be another classic leave-in demolition job, another example of conservative intellectual superiority crushing liberal talking points. The energy in the room was electric with anticipation of a complete progressive meltdown. The conservative social media sphere was lighting up with immediate approval and excitement. "Levin is destroying her already," read one tweet that immediately garnered hundreds of likes and retweets. "This is why we love the Great One," read another that was shared thousands of times within minutes. The hashtag #YouChardLevinDestroys another began trending almost immediately, with thousands of conservative accounts sharing clips of that first devastating interruption. When Levin finally paused for breath after his extended healthcare monologue, Crockett tried again with the patience of someone who had dealt with aggressive personalities her entire professional career. "As I was saying about healthcare access in rural communities," interruption number 2 came even faster than the first, like a boxer following up a jab with a crushing hook. "Rural communities?" Levin exploded, his voice reaching a volume that made several audience members jump in their seats. "You want to talk about rural communities? Your party has destroyed rural America with your environmental extremism and your war on traditional values." This interruption was noticeably more aggressive than the first, with Levin actually leaning across the table toward Crockett as he spoke, his voice carrying that dangerous edge that his radio listeners recognized as a sign that he was building toward one of his legendary tirades. The studio audience was absolutely eating it up, cheering even louder than before. Conservative viewers watching at home were celebrating what they saw as a masterful display of intellectual dominance. In sports, bars, living rooms, and conservative gathering places across America, people were cheering as if their team had just scored a touchdown. This was exactly the kind of aggressive conservative advocacy they had been hoping to see. This time, Crockett's jaw tightened slightly, the first visible sign that his behavior was registering with her, but her voice remained steady and controlled. "Mr. Levin, this is the second time you've interrupted me. I'm happy to have this discussion, but I need to be able to finish my sentences." The camera operators, following their standard training protocols, zoomed in on both faces during this exchange. What they captured would later become one of the most analyzed moments in political television history. Levin's face showed supreme confidence and satisfaction, the unmistakable look of a hunter who believed he had successfully cornered his prey. Crockett's expression was much harder to read, calm and professional on the surface, but with something deeper and more dangerous brewing underneath. In living rooms across America, Viewers were having dramatically different reactions to what they were witnessing. Conservative households were cheering Levin's aggressive style, seeing it as passionate advocacy for their deeply held values and beliefs. But in other homes, particularly those with women watching, a very different sentiment was building. "Let her talk," became a common refrain shouted at television screens. Social media was starting to pick up on the interruption pattern, but the reactions were still largely split along predictable partisan lines. Conservative accounts were celebrating Levin's dominance and intellectual superiority, while liberal accounts were expressing growing frustration with his disrespectful behavior. The hashtag "Let Her Speak" began to appear sporadically in the conversation, but hadn't yet gained significant momentum. The audience in the studio was absolutely eating up Levin's performance. His supporters saw this as classic Mark Levin, aggressive, passionate, intellectually superior, and completely in control of the conversation. They had no idea that Jasmine Crockett was deliberately letting him dig his own grave, making careful mental notes of every interruption, every condescending comment, every attempt to silence her voice. What they couldn't see was the strategic calculation happening behind Crockett's calm exterior. Years of courtroom experience had taught her that sometimes the best way to destroy an aggressive opponent was to let them reveal their true character before delivering a devastating counterattack. She was counting interruptions, cataloging disrespectful behavior, and preparing for the moment when she would turn all of his aggression against him. The third interruption came when Crockett attempted to discuss voting rights, a topic that should have allowed for substantive policy discussion. She had barely gotten 3 words out of her mouth when Levin jumped in with his trademark intensity and volume. "Voting rights!" he bellowed, his voice carrying across the studio with the force of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of intellectual intimidation. "The only voting rights being violated are the rights of legitimate American voters who are being drowned out by illegal voting and ballot harvesting." This time, Levin didn't just interrupt verbally. He actually slammed his hand on the desk for dramatic emphasis, causing Crockett's water glass to shake visibly. The gesture was clearly calculated to intimidate, to show physical dominance over the conversation and establish his alpha status in the interaction. It was a move that had worked countless times before with other guests who weren't prepared for such aggressive tactics. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch, didn't show any sign of being intimidated by his theatrical display of dominance. She simply waited patiently for him to finish his extended rant, then calmly reached for her water glass and took a deliberate sip. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable. She would not be intimidated by his theatrics or aggressive behavior. By now, Crockett's supporters on social media were starting to notice and document the clear pattern of interruptions. Comments began, flooding in from viewers who were keeping count. "Let her speak." "This is so disrespectful." "Count the interruptions." The hashtag #LetJasmineSpeak began trending with increasing momentum, though it was still being overwhelmed by pro-Levin hashtags and conservative celebration. A clip of Levin slamming his hand on the desk was shared thousands of times within minutes of it happening, but the reactions were completely divided along partisan lines. Conservative viewers saw it as passionate advocacy and intellectual dominance, while liberal viewers saw it as bullying behavior and disrespectful intimidation tactics. The battle lines were being drawn in real time across social media platforms. The fourth interruption was the most aggressive yet, a full-scale assault on both Crockett's policy positions and her right to speak. She had started to present specific, well-researched data about economic inequality when Levin slammed his hand on the desk again and shouted at a volume that made several audience members visibly uncomfortable. "I don't want to hear your socialist." "Propaganda!" he bellowed, his face reddening with the intensity of his attack. "These are the same lies that have been destroying American cities for decades." This time, something shifted noticeably in Crockett's expression. The polite, professional smile disappeared completely, replaced by the steely, focused look she had perfected during years of facing aggressive prosecutors who tried to intimidate her clients. She had been a defense attorney for years before, entering politics, and she recognized bullying tactics when she saw them. The Fox News control room was getting real-time feedback from viewers now, and it was becoming increasingly clear that opinions were sharply divided. Conservative viewers were absolutely loving Levin's performance, flooding the phone lines with praise for his aggressive advocacy and intellectual dominance. But there was also a growing number of complaints, mostly from women viewers, about his behavior toward Crockett. "Mr. Levin," she said, her voice still controlled but now carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "You've now interrupted me 4 times in less than 10 minutes. In any courtroom in America, that kind of behavior would result in immediate sanctions from the judge." Levin's response was to lean back in his chair with a smug, satisfied grin, as if her comparison to courtroom procedures proved his point about her being out of touch with real Americans. His supporters in the audience chuckled and applauded enthusiastically, thinking their champion had just scored another devastating victory against liberal elite sensibilities. But something significant was changing in the broader viewing audience. The comparison to courtroom behavior was resonating with many viewers who had never thought about the parallels between legal proceedings and television interviews. Comments began appearing online, pointing out that no judge in America would tolerate the kind of disrespectful behavior Levin was displaying. The 5th interruption came when Crockett tried to address climate policy, a topic where she had extensive expertise and well-prepared talking points. She had learned from years of legal practice that sometimes you had to let your opponent reveal their true character before you could effectively counterattack. So when Levin cut her off again, shouting about climate hysteria and environmental extremism, she simply nodded patiently and waited for him to finish his extended rant. This interruption lasted nearly 2 full minutes, with Levin going on a tangent about renewable energy policies and their supposed impact on American jobs. The camera stayed focused on both of them during this lengthy tirade, capturing Levin's animated gestures and increasingly aggressive body language, while also showing Crockett's calm, patient expression. The contrast was becoming more stark and obvious with each passing minute. But she was counting every second, cataloging every interruption, preparing every element of the devastating response she was about to deliver. Each interruption was providing her with more evidence of his disrespectful behavior, more ammunition for the counterattack that would expose him for what he really was. Online, the tide was beginning to turn as more people recognized the pattern of disrespectful behavior. While conservative accounts were still celebrating Levin's performance, a growing chorus of voices was criticizing his conduct. A viral tweet from a prominent political journalist read, "I've covered politics for 20 years and I've never seen a male interviewer interrupt a female politician this many times in such a short period. This is beyond unprofessional." The 6th interruption was the breaking point, the moment when Levin's behavior crossed from aggressive debate tactics into something much more personal and vicious. Crockett had begun to discuss her background as a defense attorney and how it informed her approach to criminal justice reform when Levin exploded with the most condescending personal attack yet. "Criminal defense attorney?" he sneered, his voice absolutely dripping with disdain and disgust. "So you've spent your entire career getting criminals back on the street. That explains everything about your backwards approach to law and order." This attack was fundamentally different from the previous interruptions. Levin wasn't just disagreeing with her policies or challenging her positions. He was attacking her character, her profession, her entire life's work, and by extension, her worth as a human being. The look of disgust on his face was clearly visible to everyone watching, and his tone carried the unmistakable message that he considered her beneath contempt. The audience reaction was noticeably mixed now. While Levin's core supporters still cheered and applauded, others were beginning to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Even some conservatives in the audience were starting to think that maybe, just maybe, he was going too far. A few audience members could be seen shaking their heads disapprovingly or looking genuinely uncomfortable with the personal nature of the attack. Social media was exploding with reactions to this latest interruption. The hashtag #6interruptions was now trending alongside "Let Jasmine Speak," with viewers keeping detailed count in real time. Video compilations showing all 6 interruptions back-to-back were being shared thousands of times, and the reaction was becoming increasingly negative, even from some conservative commentators who normally supported Levin. A prominent Republican strategist tweeted something that immediately went viral. "I agree with Mark on policy issues, but this behavior is completely unacceptable. We can disagree on issues without being disrespectful to our opponents." The tweet signaled that even some on the political right were growing uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Crockett took a deep breath, her expression showing the calm focus of someone who had just been given the perfect opening for a devastating counterattack. Her training as a defense attorney had taught her that the most devastating responses often came after letting your opponent think they were winning. She had let Levin interrupt her 6 times, had let him show the entire viewing audience exactly what kind of person he really was. The setup was now complete. Every interruption had been carefully catalogued. Every disrespectful gesture had been captured on camera. Every condescending comment had been recorded for posterity. The audience had witnessed 6 separate instances of a 73-year-old man trying to silence a 43-year-old woman through volume, aggression, and intimidation. Now it was time for her 7th response. And this one would end the debate, destroy Levin's reputation, and change the rules of political discourse forever. In the control room, producers were getting increasingly mixed signals from their audience research team. While Levin's core demographic was still responding positively to his aggressive performance, there were deeply concerning trends in other demographics, particularly women and younger viewers. But it was too late to change course now. They were live on national television, and the confrontation was building to its inevitable climax. The studio fell into an eerie, expectant silence as Jasmine Crockett leaned forward in her chair, her eyes locking directly onto Mark Levin's with the focused intensity of a laser beam. For 6 devastating interruptions, she had maintained perfect composure while he had systematically revealed his true character to millions of watching Americans. Now, with the surgical precision of a world-class attorney and the devastating force of a sledgehammer, she was about to deliver the most crushing political counterpunch in recent television history. "Mr. Levin," she began, her voice carrying a calm authority that instantly silenced even his most vocal supporters in the studio audience. "You have just interrupted me 6 times in 15 minutes. 6 times you have demonstrated to the American people that you believe your voice matters more than mine. 6 times you have shown this nation the exact kind of disrespect that women, particularly women of color, face every single day in this country." Levin opened his mouth to deliver what would have been his 7th interruption, the habitual aggressive response that had served him so well throughout his career. But something about Crockett's raised hand and steely, unwavering gaze stopped him cold. For perhaps the first time in decades, Mark Levin found himself speechless, not by choice, but by the sheer force of someone else's presence. "No, sir. Not this time," she continued, her voice gaining strength and authority with every word. "You've had your turn to speak over me, to dismiss me, to try to silence me. Now it's my turn to speak, and you're going to sit there and listen like the professional you claim to be." The audience was stunned into absolute silence. Even Sean Hannity, veteran of thousands of heated political debates and confrontations, sat completely transfixed by what was unfolding before his eyes. This was not going according to anyone's script, and everyone in that studio knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. Crockett continued, her voice now carrying the full weight of her years as a defense attorney who had never backed down from a fight. "You called me a criminal defense attorney like it was some kind of insult, some kind of shameful profession. You're absolutely right, Mr. Levin. I am a criminal defense attorney. And do you know what that means? It means I spent years standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. It means I faced down bullies in courtrooms across Texas who thought they could intimidate me just like you're trying to intimidate me right now. Now, the camera operators, recognizing the historic nature of what they were capturing, zoomed in on Levin's face, which had transformed from smug confidence to genuine concern and confusion. This was not the easy victory he had expected, and his legendary ability to dominate conversations was crumbling before the eyes of millions of viewers. But here's what you don't understand, Mr. Levin, Crockett pressed on, her prosecutorial training fully on display now. Those prosecutors, those judges, those lawyers who tried to talk over me, who tried to silence me, who thought a young black woman didn't belong in their courtroom, they all learned the same lesson you're about to learn right here, right now. She paused for dramatic effect, letting the tension build to an almost unbearable level while the entire studio held its collective breath. I don't back down. Not from prosecutors who thought they could intimidate me. Not from judges who thought they could rush me through my arguments. And certainly not from radio hosts who think their microphone gives them the right to disrespect elected officials of the United States Congress. The audience was completely silent now, mesmerized by the complete reversal of power dynamics they were witnessing. Even Levin's most ardent supporters seemed to realize that something significant was happening, that the balance of power in this confrontation had shifted dramatically and irreversibly. Crockett leaned back in her chair, her expression never changing from that prosecutorial intensity that had served her so well in Texas courtrooms for years. You want to attack my record as a defense attorney? Fine. Let's talk about records, Mr. Levin. Let's talk about your record. She reached into her folder with the deliberate precision of a trial lawyer about to present devastating evidence, pulling out a document and holding it up so the camera could capture it clearly. This is a transcript from your radio show 3 months ago, where you spent 22 minutes explaining to your audience why you believed women weren't suited for political leadership. You said, and I quote directly, "Women are too emotional for the tough decisions that real leadership requires. They let their feelings cloud their judgment." Levin's face went visibly pale. He clearly hadn't expected anyone to come armed with specific quotes from his own show, with documentation that could be verified and fact-checked in real time. "And here," she continued, pulling out another document with the confidence of someone who had done her homework thoroughly, "is a transcript from 2 months ago, where you told your listeners that young politicians, particularly women under 50, should sit down and learn from their betters instead of pretending they know how to govern this great nation." The studio was so quiet, you could hear the mechanical whirring of the cameras as they zoomed in for reaction shots, capturing every moment of this historic confrontation. "So let me make sure I understand your position correctly, Mr. Levin," Crockett said, her voice now carrying the full authority of someone who had just presented irrefutable evidence. "You believe women are too emotional for leadership. You believe young people should sit down and shut up. And tonight, you've proven to millions of Americans that you think your voice is more important than that of a duly elected representative of the United States Congress. Is that the Mark Levin brand of conservatism you want to present to the American people?" Levin finally found his voice, but it came out as a weak, uncertain croak instead of his usual booming authority. That's taken completely out of context," he stammered, his legendary confidence nowhere to be found. Crockett's response was swift, surgical, and absolutely devastating. "Context, Mr. Levin. I'm a lawyer. I know everything about context. I know about reading documents in their entirety, understanding nuance, and presenting evidence fairly. And the context is that for the past hour, you have shown the American people exactly who you are." She stood up now, her full presence commanding the room in a way that surprised even experienced television professionals like Sean Hannity. "Yeah, you are a man who believes that interrupting women is acceptable professional behavior. You are a man who thinks volume equals authority and that shouting equals intelligence. You are a man who has built a career on talking over people instead of talking with them, on silencing opposition instead of engaging with it." The camera captured Levin slumping back in his chair, his legendary confidence completely and utterly shattered. For perhaps the first time in his decades-long career, Mark Levin had been not just defeated, but completely and systematically dismantled by an opponent he had catastrophically underestimated. "But here's what you've also shown them tonight, Mr. Levin," Crockett continued, her voice now carrying the full weight of historic significance. You've shown them that the era of conservative men thinking they can bully democratic women into silence is over. You've shown them that when you try to interrupt us 6 times, we'll use that 7th opportunity to expose exactly what kind of person you really are. She sat back down, folded her hands in her lap with perfect composure, and looked directly into the camera with the confidence of someone who had just changed the rules of political discourse forever. Mr. Levin, the floor is yours. But I think you've said quite enough for one evening. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Mark Levin, the man who had made his fortune on never being at a loss for words, sat there staring at his hands while the entire nation waited for his response. When he finally looked up, his voice was barely above a whisper, stripped of all the bluster and aggression that had defined his career. I apologize if I came across as disrespectful, he said, the words sounding hollow and inadequate after what the audience had just witnessed. That wasn't my intention, but everyone in that studio knew it was too little, too late. The damage was done, the moment was captured forever, and American political discourse had just been fundamentally changed by a single devastating response.